Namaste. I pray for you. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by James Haughton Woods. For sense, this latter and distinct impression is not itself a coarse thing. It cannot make the coarse manifest as its object. Therefore, if an idea is to be outer, since we have shown it, it cannot be coarse or outer. Then these coarse and outer impressions may be counted, if you will, as altogether false. And you cannot say that such a false impression is just as same as a mental act. Yeah, you can't think your reality into existence, I'm sorry. For then, you would have to admit that the mental act is as empty as this false impression. Well, I'm not sorry. So as to resume the argument, tathata cha, insofar as the act of being perceived is not less extensive in the absence of a difference between the idea and the object, how can the fact of its being perceived refute the fact of the difference? And as to being invariably altogether, just as is in the case of the mental act and of the coarseness, the one existent and the other non-existent, so likewise in the case of the two existing things, the being perceived invariably together may be explained on the ground of the nature of things or on the ground of some kind of an obstruction in the thinking apparatus. Accordingly, these two fallacious middle terms put forth by the opponent, because they are non-conclusive, only give rise to an empty abstraction, vikalpa. If there be no external thing, and the authority of a perception is not to be gainsaid by a mere empty abstraction. So the point was well taken when he said, by an abstraction, vikalpa, thinking without force of proof. By this discussion, we must understand that also the view which attempts to prove that objects are ideas, urged as a ground that ideas have no external basis, is, as illustrated by the ideas of a dream, is also overthrown, and the alternatives, vikalpa, regarding the object of the elation, have been offered in rebuttal by stating that the relation between the whole and part, for details, nyaya kandika, is to be consulted, so there is no need of details here. Why is this incorrect? Okay, well, certainly things should be answered in one volume, so a footnote. Oh, that's true. Oh, well, we don't. Things are pretty well answered, aren't they? 15. Because while the physical thing remains the same, the mind stuffs are different. Therefore, the two are upon distinct levels of existence. And let's... Okay, yeah, let's repeat it. A single physical thing is the common physical basis for many mind stuffs. It is not, of course, figured forth by a single mind stuff, nor yet is it figured forth by many mind stuffs. It is rather grounded in itself. Why is this? Because the physical thing remains the same. The mind stuffs are different. When the mind stuff is in relation with right conduct, the mind stuff has thoughts of pleasure, the physical thing remaining the same. When in relation with wrong living, from the same physical thing, it has thoughts of pain. When in relation with undifferentiated consciousness, from the same physical thing, it has thoughts of infatuation. When in relation with complete insight, from the same thing, it has thoughts of detachment. If this is so, by whose mind stuff would this thing be formed? Nor would it be sound to say that one person's mind stuff is affected when brought into relation with an object formed by the mind stuff of another person, Consequently, the physical thing and the thought distinct because of dissimilarity, in that the thing is the object for knowledge, and the thought is the process of knowing, are upon distinct levels of existence. There is not even a trace of blending of the two. But from the point of view of the Samkhya, since the thing has three aspects, guna, and since the changes of the aspects are unstable, it comes into relation with the mind-stuffs of men, dependent for its existence in this case or the other upon such determinants as right living, or wrong living, or undifferentiated consciousness, or complete insight. It becomes the cause, in one form or another, of presented ideas as they rise into consciousness, corresponding in quality to the determining efficient cause. So having in this manner, independently of the sutra, given the reason for setting up the physical thing as something over and above the mental act, the author of the comment introduces the reason as given in the sutra itself by the words, "Why is this?" 15. Because while the physical thing remains the same, the mind stuffs are different. Therefore, the two are upon distinct levels of existence. Whatever units are in the manifold, these differ absolutely from the manifold. For instance, a single thought in Chaitra or in Maitra, and distinct from the presented ideas in the Devadatta and in Vishnu Mitra, which are dissimilar. And since the intended object is not different, even when the thoughts about it are manifold, it is other than the mental acts. And further, the identity of the intended object, although the thoughts of those who know it validly are different, is determined by the connexion of one thought with another in memory. For the case of a single woman who is presented to the minds of several persons, enamored or ill-disposed, or infatuated or detached, we see a reciprocal connexion, so that one thinks, she who is seen by you is seen by me also. Consequently, while the physical thing remains the same, because the mind-stuffs are different, because there is a difference of thoughts, therefore the two, intended object and the thought, are upon distinct levels of existence, that is, distinct means of distinguishing the external attribute. In the lover, a thought of pleasure with reference to the woman loved. In rival mistress, a thought of pain. But in Chaitra, who has not obtained her, a thought of infatuation, a depression. This may be so, the objector says. But the intended object, with the distinguishing characteristic of being loved, is figured forth by mind stuff of one person, and this same intended object affects the mind stuff of the others also. So this mind stuff might be supposed to be common. Well, collective consciousness and intuition that we all reach into is certainly possible. In reply to this, he says, nor would it be another. For if it were so, when a person has the thought of blue, all would have the thought of blue. A further objection would be this: even according to the view which maintains the distinct existence of objects, Atharvavada, how can one and the same object be the cause of mental acts differing according to the difference in pleasure and other experiences? For from a cause which is not different in its distinguishing characteristics, there should be no difference in effects. In reply to this, he says, from the point of view of the Samkhya, it is quite consistent to say that the same external thing, which is a mutation of the three aspects guna, has three forms. The objector says, even if it be so, then all, without distinction, would have a mental act of pleasure and of pain and of infatuation. In reply to this, he says, dependent for its existence upon such determinants as right living. The sattva, accompanied by the rajas and determined by right living, produces the sensation of happiness. But the same sattva, when determined by knowledge, vidya, after the rajas has been removed, gives rise to a sense of detachment. A right living and other experiences are not all in persons. Some of it is in some persons. So the arrangement of pleasures and of pains is quite consistent. There are some who say that a thing is coextensive with its thought insofar as, like pleasure and the other experience, it is experienced. In this way, when they thus reject the quality of being common to several mind stuffs, they deny the existence of the thing in both its earlier and latter moments. Well, cause and effect can hit us pretty hard in this life, and some of that can be deserved. But let's not result to gospel of prosperity thinking of, oh, I must be good because I'm getting good, and I must be bad because I'm getting better. 16. And as the thing is not dependent upon a single mind stuff, for then in certain cases it could not be proved by that mind stuff, and then what would it be? If a thing were dependent upon a single mind stuff, then if the mind stuff be distracted or restricted, it itself would be untouched by that mind stuff, and not coming within the range of that mind stuff, and not being proved by that mind stuff, and unperceived in its nature by anyone, would it then be at all? And how could it be produced again in relation to the mind stuff? It would not possess those parts of it which are not apparent, so that if one says the back does not exist, neither could the belly be known. Consequently, an intended object is independent of mind stuff and common to all the selves, and again, independent mind stuffs function differently for each self. As a result of a relation between these two, the intended object and the mind stuff, there follows an apperception, an experience of the self. On this point, there are some disputations. On this point, there are some disputatious persons who say that the object is coessential with the idea, because it is the object of experience, like pleasure. What he means to say is this: the intended object might be admitted to be distinct from knowledge, since it still is insensate, jadda. It can not be perceived in absence of knowledge, but it must be illumined by the knowledge. Luciferianism is bringing forth one's illumination. Accordingly, the object is only at the time of the idea, and not at other times, since there is no evidence that it exists at other times. This is the author of a comment confutes independently of the sutra in the words "in this way" when they, for a physical thing, vastu, is experienced by ordinary observers as common to all mind stuffs, and as persisting in the succession of various moments, and as consisting of a mutation. Now if the thing is coessential with the mental act, then it would be of this sort, that its appearance and disappearance would be coessential with the appearance and disappearance of the idea. If so, how can one set up to anurodha, this objective factor, idamancha, so that one shall not at the same time deny it? This is the meaning. Or we may suppose that there is not a denial of this objective factor. Let the intended object be coessential with the knowledge. To this, also the reply is in the Sutra 16. And the thing is not dependent upon a single mind stuff. It could not be proved. Then, what would it be? For the same mind stuff, which perceives a water jar, when distracted by another substance, such as a piece of cloth, does not remain upon the water jar, or when the mind stuff, which has discrimination as its object, attains at that very time to restriction. At all these times, since there is no knowledge of the water jar or of the discrimination, the water jar and the discrimination being dependent for their existence upon one particular knowledge only, would surely cease when this knowledge ceases. the Quran talks about continual maintenance, but God's holding everything into existence is not the same thing as we personally. Well, a tree falls in the forest, it makes no sound because no people can hear it. Um, Definitely, we're not fools like that. At least I hope anybody who's gotten this far in this program, or maybe they need to go back a few programs in this series to, work their way through some things. This, he says, in the words dependent upon a single mind stuff. The words, how could it be, mean that it could not be. How does it happen? That the mind stuff is in relation to this thing, whether it be a water jar or discrimination. For the effects invariably are where the cause is, and invariably are not where the cause is not. Without regard to their own particular cause, they cannot be produced by another cause. And if they are supposed to be causeless, then one would have to deny such an inconsistency as the accidental existence of them, the effects. Now, some people speak of a causal, but a causal is really a creation in itself, too. So, again, not talking about. And there's no ground for saying that whatever causes the knowledge of the thing also causes the thing. For then it would follow that the taste and the sensific power and the digestion and so on would be the same whether one makes use of an actual sweetmeat or of a sweetmeat of hope. Therefore the point is well taken when he says, and how could it be produced again in relation to the mind's stuff? Furthermore, the front part of anything is implied by the middle and the hind part. But if the existence of a thing were to depend upon the knowledge, then the upper and middle parts would not exist, since this idea of them is not an experience. And accordingly, since the pervader, the upper and the middle parts, are not the lower part which is pervaded, would also not be. And thus, if the whole object be absent, how could it be urged that the intended object is coexistential with the knowledge? As he says, it would not possess those parts. The words are not apparent, mean, are not perceived. He brings the discussion to a close by saying, consequently, the rest is easy. Well, we definitely, whether we look at this, look at things as scholarly advice or prophetic advice or straight up revealed word for word advice, things got to be worked through, and that part isn't necessarily easy, but it sounds the comment of such can be easy. 17. A thing is known or not known by virtue of its affecting or not affecting the mind stuff. Objects of sense, like magnets, bind to themselves the mind stuff, as if it had qualities of iron and affect it. The object whereby the mind stuff is affected is known, but the self, who is other than this, is not known. The mind stuff enters into mutations because the nature of the thing is now known, and now not known. This might be conceded, but as the objector says, if the object is to be independent in that it is insensate, it can never throw out light, or if it does throw out light, then its insensate character would vanish, and so it would cease also to be. For surely a thing cannot exist after casting off its own nature. Moreover, it cannot be urged that throwing out light is a property of the intended object, which is really insensate by nature, and this property is put into it by the organs. For if throwing out light were to be a property of the intended object, it would be, like blueness, common to all persons. Thus, if a single person knows the meaning of the philosophical systems, then all would be scholars, and there would be no incompetent persons. Nor is it correct to say that a present external aspect should exist in the past or in the future. Therefore, that an intended object exists independently, as an object of an apperception, is nothing but a wish. And to reply to this, he recites the Sutra. 17. A thing is known or not known by virtue of its affecting the mind stuff. And not everybody can learn, not everybody can, comment, but But in general, we want to be able to trust our own conclusions and work towards that. And certainly, personal scholarship may not amount to being a scholar in some people, and that's sometimes fine. Although the intended object is by nature insensate, still by the channel of the organs it affects the mind stuff, the energy of intellect, chitta chakta, whose reflection enters into the mirror of the mind stuff, which is in such a state of being affected. It has been just described, enlivening, Chetayamana, the mind stuff, which is affected by the intended object. Experience is the intended object. Chitta chakta, saying, oh, it's just one chakra. Well, yeah, it is, but no, you don't get rid of your other chakras, like somebody's been saying online. But it does not impart to the object anything like visibility. Neither is the energy of intellect out of relation with the mind stuff, for we have said that its reflection unites with the mind. And although both the mind stuff, because it is omnipresent, well, it's present to a degree, certainly more than a lot of people may realize, and the organ which is made of the personality substances are not in relation with the object of sense, still the mind stuff, which has its fluctuation in any particular body, is in relation with objects of sense. Thus it is that the objects are said to be like a magnet, since the mind stuff is like the iron in its properties, the objects having by the channel of the organs brought into it by relation affect it, and hence the mind stuff is capable of mutations, as he says of the thing. Now, but as for the self, for whom the mind stuff is an object of sense. So we come across a different issue here. And this different issue, we may look at it in terms of the consciousness. No matter how we look at it, most of our consciousness is not, it's not in our readily accessible, oh, I'm aware of this. Your mind, your field of consciousness through your organs and stuff, it's aware of far more than one is thinking of. Something you're not even feeling or hearing or seeing, if that starts to go wrong, it knows it before you're thinking, well, I notice my heart rate's off. But, well, maybe that's not the best example. But, yeah, a lot of people will not even notice even that. So, yeah, but shifting our awareness, that's the part of the definition of magic that some people will throw on you. So, we don't have to get out our pointy hats. Although I see my pointy hat over there. 18. Unintermittently, the master of that mind stuff knows the fluctuations of mind stuff, and thus the self undergoes no mutations. If, like the mind stuff, the master also, that is the self, should undergo mutation, then fluctuations of mind stuff, which are its objects, would be like objects of sense, the sounds and other perceptible things, sometimes known and sometimes not known. The fact, however, that the central organ is unintermittently known by its master, the self, leads us to infer that the self is an entity that undergoes no mutations. Thus, then, he has established the existence of the intended object as distinct from mind stuffs, now with the intent of showing that self is distinct from these mind stuffs, whose nature is to enter into mutation. He asserts the self's immutability, the quality which differentiates from this mind stuff. This he does by supplying some words and by reciting the sutra. But as for the self, whom the same mind stuff is an object of sense, 19. Unintermittently, The master of that knows the fluctuations of the mind stuff, and the self undergoes no mutations. The mind stuff, whether it be restless or infatuated, or distracted, or in a state of focusedness, is always up to the time of restriction, experienced by the self as in mutation. Why is this so? Because the self does not undergo mutation. If he entered into mutations, then the self also, like the mind stuffs, would sometimes know objects of sense and sometimes not, whereas objects of sense are only known and never unknown to him. Therefore, he does not undergo mutation, and as a result of something distinct from the things that are in mutation, the same he says in the words, if like the mind stuff. It is the central organ when in fluctuation that he unintermittently knows. Of this he is the master and owner. In other words, the experiencer. Of this master, the self, the above fact leads us to infer the immutability. To explain, the point is the self, which does not enter into mutation, is distinct from the mind stuff, which enters into mutation. Should the doubt arise whether the mind stuff, like fire, illumines itself, and at the same time illuminates objects. The self-actualization, the self-mastery, and its effect on those who witness it. Key points to what actual Luciferianism is, rather than this idea that it's only a disguised Satanism. 19. It does not illuminate itself, since it is an object for sight, just as the organs of sense and the sounds and other perceptible things do not illumine themselves, since they are objects for sight. So the central organ is to be represented, and accordingly, fire, as an example, could not apply to it, for fire does not throw light upon its own self, which, before, was something without light. And here, light is thrown only when there is a relation of the light giver with something which is yet to be lighted. Lucifer means light bringer, to remove the confusions, not talk about the devil. Furthermore, such a relation of a thing does not occur with the thing itself. Besides the meaning of words, the mind stuff illumines itself. It is that it is not an object for knowledge for anyone. Just the words, air is grounded in itself, means that it is not grounded in something else, for the reason that creatures are conscious by reflection of the process of their own thinking substances. When they say, I am angry, I am afraid, I feel a passion for that person, I am angry with that person, there is purposive action. This is impossible unless there be a knowledge of one's own thinking substance. With the words, should the doubt arise, he sets up a destructionist, Vainachika, as an opponent, who argues as follows: all this may be so, provided mind stuff be the object of the self, but this it is not. On the contrary, this mind stuff throws light upon itself and illumines the objects and originates in dependence upon previous mind stuff. How then can the self always have the objects perceived? And still more, how can it be distinct from the mind stuff which enters into mutation? 19. It does not illumine itself, since it is an object for sight. It might be so, self-illuminating, providing the mind stuff had consciousness of itself. This, however, it does not have. It is like the color blue, an object capable of being included in experience so far as it undergoes mutation, and whatever is capable of being included in experience cannot throw light upon itself, for it cannot be a fluctuation with regard to itself, and not be to mind stuff, since the same thing cannot be the act, the object of the act, and one of the relations of the act, for the act of cooking is not cooked, nor is the act of chopping chopped. For the other hand, the self does not undergo mutation, and is not an object of experience. Therefore, with reference to him, self-enlightenment is not inexplicable. For his self-enlightenment is nothing but an enlightenment which is not dependent on any other, and it is not his being an object of experience. Therefore, because it is an object for sight, the mind stuff, which is the object of seeing, does not illumine in itself the objects of the fluctuation of that mind stuff only, which has the reflections of light of the self, Atman, throw light. This is the point. An objector says, but you don't see the fire is an object for sight, and yet has enlightenment in itself. It is not with a fire, as it is with water jars, and so on, which may be manifest by the light of a fire. For a fire is not made manifest by another fire. Well, fires can start other fires, can't they? In reply to this, he says, and so the fire, as an example. Why? For the fire does not. The meaning is that the fire does not require any other fire to throw light upon it, but has light thrown upon it by a mental act. So it does not throw light upon itself. Thus fire is not an exception to general principle stated in the sutra. This is the meaning. The word here is the expression, and here the light is thrown distinguishes fire from the light which is the nature of the self. In other words, the light which is of an active kind. What he means to say is this: wherever there is an action, it is in all cases seen to exist as related to an agent, and to an instrument of action, and to an object, just as we see the act of cooking as related to chaitra, and to the fire, and to the rice. Similarly, throwing light is an action, and this action, too, must be in the same threefold relation. Now, a relation must be based upon a difference. It is impossible where there is no difference. This is the meaning. When it is said, besides, the meaning of the words, the mind stuff illumines itself, is that it is not an object for knowledge for anyone. The objector grants this may be so, but let it not be said that the mind stuff is an object for knowledge. For when the process of knowing, which is neither the cause nor the pervader of the mind stuff, is repressed, it does not follow that this mind stuff must be repressed. To this he replies, of their own thinking substance. The thinking substance means the mind stuff. Movements mean functional activities. Beings mean living beings. The different fluctuations of mind stuff, anger or greed, for instance, are together with their basis, the mind stuff, and with their objects experienced by each individual, and refute that statement that the mind stuff is not an object for knowledge. He makes clear this same perception of the movements of one's own thinking substance by the words, I am angry. And I guess I gotta stop there. Namaste. We pray.